Hi, my name is Mike Dillard, and this is Self-Made Man, the podcast for men who want to leave their mark on the world and create a legacy of honor, integrity, and achievement in every aspect of their lives. I'm glad you're here, and once again, it is time to forge your destiny. It's wrecked the careers of promising young geniuses. It's evaporated great fortunes and run companies into the ground. It's made adversity unbearable and turned struggle into shame. It's the difference between a boss and a true leader. It is the enemy of ambition, success, and resilience. And this is your ego. And today, we sit down with my good friend Ryan Holiday to learn how to destroy it before it destroys you. Hey everybody, Mike Dillard here, and today we are joined with my fellow Austinite and friend Ryan Holiday for, Ryan, I have to say, your second round here on the show. I believe you're the only guest so far, other than
I'm flattered.
Than Porter Stansberry, that we've had on the show twice. So thank you for joining us. I loved our first interview together on PR, and today we're going to be talking about another subject that I think both of us have obviously found quite interesting, but you've taken this to the nth degree in your quest to help all of us become better people, which is diving into ego and how that can serve us and also be the cause or source of destruction for many of us, specifically in your brand new book, Ego is the Enemy. So thanks for coming on once again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to chat again.
Absolutely. We're here trying to survive the Texas Austin monsoon.
Yeah, the Texas flood, man, it's real.
Yeah, well, the good news is it means we'll have water in the lake for at least 4 or 5 more years,
yes.
Which is always nice. But thanks for joining us. And this is a topic that I'm very interested to learn more about and to get your take on because, I'm 38 years old now and I've hit a point of reflection where I've gone through at least a couple of stages in my personal development and career where I can see some pretty big changes, specifically over the last, I'd say 3 years since I hit around 35 that I've undertaken. And I've also seen how this affects people in our space when it comes to, let's just call it the guru world. Yeah. If you will, for better or worse. So where would you like to start?
Yeah, no, I think you raise an interesting point, especially for those of us who have sort of been around the block a little bit or accomplished something. I think what I tend to find when I talk to people who are in your position or I look back at my own life is like if you were to look back at, say, like the 3 or 4 biggest mistakes you made or the most painful experiences that you went through that were, not like a physical injury, I imagine if you were being honest with yourself, you would say that sort of ego was at the root of them in one form or another, right? Like my biggest business mistake was sort of starting a company, not necessarily one that I wanted to start, but one that I thought I would make a ton of money in. And I sort of blew past the objections of some friends and family, clear red flags in retrospect that I pushed aside. Greed or delusion or delusions of grandeur can be these sort of overpowering forces that really get us into trouble. And sort of what I've realized, in writing this book and thinking about this a lot is that life is hard enough, right? The things that we're trying to do, whether it's write a book or start a company or build a brand, these are incredibly difficult things to do just on paper. But then if you introduce into that difficult task, ego and its many manifestations, whether that's feelings of superiority, whether that's an inability to listen to other people, whether that's, sort of self-obsession and a lack of empathy, it makes those things incredibly difficult, if not impossible. And it makes failing at those things, which is, common enough already, oftentimes catastrophic. So what I wanted to look at and what I've become fascinated by is sort of the way in which we erect obstacles for ourselves or we go around shutting doors in our own face.
That was going to lead me to 2 questions, which is what inspired you to dedicate at least the last couple of years of your life to writing this book? And then 2, if you could give us a very basic definition of ego, because I think for probably 70-80% of the audience listening to this, and I'll go ahead and throw myself in that category, it can be a very transient term. It can be, a very undefined, if you will. So Why did you dedicate so much time to this topic, and what is your definition of ego?
Yeah, we should probably start with the definition because it's funny. Like, I feel like ego is very clear and very obvious, and that was one of the things my publisher pushed back on. I think we overthink ego, right? So I'm not talking about ego in the Freudian sense, which is, complicated, confusing. I'm not even talking about in the psychological sense, like what some sort of egotist diagnosis would be. It's like that definition of pornography. You sort of know it when you see it. It's ego is Bill Walsh says, like when confidence becomes arrogance, right? I think that's a great, quick definition. But I sort of use it as an umbrella term for when our understanding of reality becomes distorted by what we wish to be true, what we want, what we think about ourselves. When we've ceased to live in the real world and begun to live in a world of our own illusions, that's ego. And so I think that's very different than, like one of the things I get when people have talked to me about this book is they'll go, isn't a little bit of ego a good thing? And I'll say, of course not. There's no way that living in an illusion is ever a good thing. Confidence, on the other hand, is great, right? Confidence is not an illusion. It's based on realism. It's an understanding of your own abilities and your own sort of place in the pecking order and the hierarchy based on the work that you've done or what you bring to the table. So I'm making a distinction between ego and confidence and saying, ego is when you pass confidence and you get into a place where you're not dealing with a clear and defined sort of understanding of the world. You're dealing with what you wish to be true. And so, I felt like studying this not just because, I saw the destruction of American Apparel, which was this, one of the fastest growing fashion brands in history. It wasn't sunk by any outside forces. It imploded internally. And that was obviously fascinating to me. Although I set out to write this book before that happened, I was just fascinated with some of the emails that I would get, especially from young people. I would get these 700, 800 word emails from people telling me how great they were and how awesome they were. And then they would describe problems that they were facing. And it was like they couldn't understand that maybe this sort of overconfidence, this sort of diluted understanding of their own abilities might be responsible for some of the problems that they were getting through. And I think the third thing that motivated me to write the book was really, being someone who became pretty successful pretty early on in my career, dropping out of college at 19, working for people a lot older than me, working in some environments where it was pretty clear I was to be seen and not heard. I realized how quickly that, if you start to believe your own bullshit, if you start to think that you're a prodigy or a wunderkind or, that you're hot shit, you are going to not last very long. You're going to get yourself in some serious trouble. And so all these things are sort of swirling around in my head. And I felt like it was a natural follow-up to Obstacle is the Way, which was about, sort of dealing with the things that are outside us. This is what we have to deal with that is inside us.
And what, I'm assuming that through your exploration of this, and I haven't had a chance to read the book, I just got it a couple of days ago, that you've discovered a methodology or a process for navigating this.
Yeah. So basically in the book, I sort of break down the three sort of phases where ego manifests itself. And first, that's when we're aspiring to do something. The ego manifests itself in a number of ways, right? That's, entitlement, that's bad priorities, that's an overestimation of our own abilities. That's an inability to listen to other people. And then, the next phase, maybe we're super talented and we manage to succeed in some form or another. Now ego manifests itself differently here, right? This is complacency. This is believing that we've made it. This is paranoia, micromanagement, overreaching, right? That ego manifests itself differently when we've succeeded versus when we're starting. And then finally, let's say, and oftentimes ego is what brings us to this situation. Let's say we failed in some way, a venture collapsed, we've been attacked, we're dealing with some sort of difficult circumstance. Now here, ego manifests itself differently, right? Now ego blames other people instead of learning from what happened, or ego gives way to hatred or resentment, or oftentimes we sort of double down on whatever strategies caused the problems in the first place, and we make our situation worse. So my premise is that ego is the worst sort of element you can introduce, whether you're trying to do something, whether you've succeeded at something, or you're struggling with something. Ego's a bad ingredient, and you conquer that differently in each phase. But the idea is that ego is your enemy sort of every single step of the way, no matter what you're doing or where you happen to be in your own life. And the reality is we're often in these phases simultaneously, or we go from one to the other, right? You succeed, and now all of a sudden you've got a new goal. You started one company, you want to start another company. Well, if you've told yourself that your last company succeeded because you're a genius who knows better than everyone else, well, you've now made succeeding a second time more difficult because you've lost your sense of reality, right? You've lost your understanding of what truly did make you successful the first time.
So what is the difference between being and doing?
Yeah, so there's this famous speech from John Boyd that he would give, and this is something I think is essential when you're starting out. He's a famous military strategist. I strongly urge everyone to study him. There's an amazing biography about him by Robert Coram. But John Boyd was a brilliant fighter pilot who eventually became a colonel, and he worked in the Pentagon, where he shepherded through the F-15 and the F-16. His sort of strategic insights were essential in winning the first Gulf War. But he was really famous as sort of a groomer of young men who were going places in the armed forces, especially in the Pentagon. And he would give this speech to a young acolyte as they started to pick up some heat, essentially. And he would say, look, you're going to come to a fork in the road. And the fork in the road, he said, is asking you to be or to do. And essentially he was deciding, like, look, are you going to be a person who moves up high in the ranks because you're playing the game and you're playing politics? Or are you going to be someone who contributes a lot and accomplishes a lot and does real things? And I think when we're young, we forget that those are different paths, right? The guy that makes for, a nice brown noser who sort of works his way up through, into the boss's good graces is very different than someone who holds themselves maybe to a set of principles, who puts the work or the company or the cause above all. And so he's really deciding, like, look, are you going to be, an empty suit, or are you going to be someone who makes a difference in this life? And ego wants recognition. It wants credit. It wants to be in the media. It wants to be, given its due respect. Someone like John Boyd, like, even though he might have been the greatest strategic mind of the last 50 years, there's no aircraft carriers named after John Boyd. Most people don't even know what he accomplished. But he was fine with that because he wanted to do instead of to be. And so, that was something I heard very early on in my career. And I'm glad that I did, because, having the wrong priorities, like, let's say you're going to do whatever you're going to do for the next 50 years. If you're starting now with bad priorities, that's going to have some real consequences for you over the course of your life. If at every juncture you're choosing to get credit or to tell people what they want to hear instead of the truth, instead of a longer game, I think you're going to find it extraordinarily difficult to do anything that really matters. And so that's that essential idea of to be or to do is something you've got to figure out pretty early on, or you're going to find yourself very far from where you want to be in life.
One of the first examples that pops in my head as you're talking about this, specifically when it comes to, let's just say, the solopreneur, kind of new entrepreneur world, right, is the pursuit of money or a result rather than a mission.
Yes. Meaning,
for folks who are listening, anytime I have been in a position where I've had to make a decision for money, let's say, hey, we need to make $300,000 this month or nobody's going to get paid,
Right.
And we've had to create a product or to do some kind of promotion to pull that off out of necessity. It is just a giant distraction and throws you off track, or it's just a wrench in the plan where it's every time that I've stuck to mission and a higher purpose and goal for the reason why I've pursued my business and built it, it's always worked out infinitely better in a much more longer term as well. And
Sure.
So I mean, that's the first really big concrete example that I've personally experienced, during my journey.
Well, and look, I think this is the same for being a successful writer or really any sort of career. When you start to get really good at something, you're going to get, I don't think people necessarily understand this. You start to get offers or inquiries from people who want you to do other things, right? They're like, hey, do you want to do this? Hey, I'd like you to come work for me. Hey, will you take this project on? And it's very difficult to say no, right? When someone's offering you money to do something or presenting some seemingly interesting opportunity. But if you don't have a strong sort of internal compass, and I'm not talking about right or wrong here, because it's not like they're asking you to like go out and kill someone or, sell drugs. It's that they're saying, hey, I know you do what you do, but I'd like for you to hit pause on that for a second and come work on this other thing. And if you don't have a strong sense then of what you're really trying to accomplish, what strategy or goal or mission is guiding you in life, you can find yourself very quickly very far from the path that you set out on. And this again, John Boyd wasn't saying that you're not going to be well paid and that it won't be appeal to your vanity, but he's saying, if you don't have this higher sense of purpose or mission, you are going to, be constantly hitting pause on these important things, and you might never be able to hit play again. And so you've got to be able to say no. You've got to be able to say, hey, that sounds amazing and I would love to do it, but I can't because my real work is what's calling to me right now. And it can be often that real work, deciding to stick with it, might mean, that you stay out of the spotlight for a while. It might mean watching other people that make more money than you, or it might mean a lot of things in the short term that feel like you're making a mistake, but if you really are guided by this larger purpose, you can overcome that.
What's really interesting over the last, let's say 5, 6, 7 years, specifically since the rise of social media, is that has given us as a species unparalleled access to people and to emotions in their lives. And I'm going to try and articulate this the best way that I can, but on one hand, you have folks who are very, very good at displaying their ego on social media. Right?
Yes, totally.
And they've made a living out of that, such as the Kardashians, is the first example that comes to mind. And what's really been interesting is that, on the other hand, social media and just the rules of life, if you will, are also providing all of those individuals with enough rope to then hang themselves and then to ultimately be exposed for the normal humans that they are. And so it's been very, very interesting as we get less and less privacy on an annual basis, where more and more of our lives are exposed to everybody else around us. And this is all done on an equal basis almost with each of us.
Mm-hmm.
That I've started to see a trend where people are just becoming more accepting, and they're also rewarding individuals who are open and honest and transparent about their humanity, and meaning when their ego takes a hit and they take a fall, and if they accept that and admit that, and they're just like, yeah, I screw up too, then the world has started to reward that. Because I think at the end of the day, while it might be interesting and fun to watch these people who are living lives that, for a lot of young people out there specifically, they might aspire to have, at the end of the day, the truth, always comes out. And there's almost been like this embracement of like, oh yeah, you screw up too. You're just like me.
Sure.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I found that really interesting.
I certainly do. I mean, look, I think social media presents a lot of opportunities for distraction, right? So, hey, I've got to keep an Instagram feed, I got to keep a Snapchat, I got to keep a Facebook, I have to keep a Twitter. And so that's been really bad for a lot of people, in the sense that now, instead of focusing on their craft, they're sort of off doing all these things that feel like their craft, but are really mostly just sort of chatter and talk. And I think, podcasts are a great example of this. Like, I love podcasts and I listen to a bunch of them. However, compared to this sort of old media environment, there was like, a number of radio stations, a number of newspapers, whatever. So if someone, if there's some media inquiry, you're probably good to take it because it can help advance your career or get you some exposure, right? Well, now there's 100,000 or 1,000,000 podcasts out there, right? And so literally, like, I get probably, 10 inquiries a week for different podcasts. So if I was motivated by sort of hearing my own voice, and I wasn't very objective about what moved the needle or not, I could spend 10 hours a week talking on podcasts, right? And that would not be a good use of my limited life, because we don't know how much planet or time we have on this planet. And it would take me away from my actual work. And I think what you're saying is like, look, you can connect with people on social media and have these sort of superficial, inauthentic connections, or, you could channel an authentic, real, truthful connection to an audience through your work and by talking about things that actually matter. So it's like, am I going to take a picture and put it on Instagram of a pretty sunset and say that I'm being creative and artistic? Or is that better for me to say, hey, I'm going to make a video that, I'm going to work on for the next 2 weeks that I think is going to reach a large audience and is going to be something that only I could make? Or am I going to write an article and really pour myself into it? Am I going to create something that matters? And so I think if your ego is just, hey, I got to get as much attention as I humanly can, and I cannot pass on a single opportunity to get to get one eyeball looking at me, that is going to suck the life force out of you and really suck you away from the job you need to be doing, versus saying, hey, what is the greatest return on my investment of time, which happens to be our most precious resource? What is the lever that I have that reaches the most people, that has the most impact, and how can I double down on that and put the as much of my force there as possible? And how can I make sure that I'm not just, chasing imaginary internet validation, and I really am, attempting to do something that matters?
What are your thoughts on the current, let's call it just high school, college generation out there? Not the millennials, the generation after them, because I am personally quite concerned that there's a very good chance that entire generation is going to have some kind of psychosis.
Yeah,
with cameras, cameras pointed at their faces all the time.
So I'm a millennial, and obviously I've seen sort of my generation get branded a certain way, and I realize sort of how unhelpful it is to sort of cast everyone in the same light. However, there's been some really interesting psychological studies on what they call the imaginary audience. And the imaginary audience is something that's sort of part of the normal development of consciousness. If you remember back to when you were like 10 or 11 years old, something embarrassing would happen to you at school, and you would be convinced that everyone saw, and you'd be mortified, and you wouldn't want to go to school the next day. Or, you think of the little girl spending, 2 hours in front of the mirror before she gets ready for school, even though, none of this matters and nobody cares, right? But we're supposed to grow. So the imaginary audience is just, part of discovering who we are and where we fit into the world. And we're supposed to grow out of that. We're supposed to grow out of performing for, the world that is actually quite indifferent to who we are and what we're doing. Most of the time, the things that we're embarrassed about or think everyone is noticing, nobody even sees. And so I think the problem with social media and some of the narcissistic nature of our culture, and I think it's gotten worse for my generation and then the generation after me, is that we're not coming out of the imaginary audience. Think about what we call the people on Twitter. We call them our followers. Who used to have followers? Like cult leaders and and dictators, right? But now that's like a term that we use, and we really are. It's like, ooh, I got to put this on Facebook. Got to let people know, and so we really are performing for an audience. Like, you and I, we actually do have an audience. It's not like the same as the Rolling Stones or something, but we have an audience that is real, that's quantifiable. We know that it's there, and we also know how dangerous it is that can go to your head. That if you're focused too much on what the audience thinks or wants, like that's actually the death of your creativity. You can become a slave to that audience. And so we know going into our career that the audience is something that you have to manage and you have to think about. But to have every single member of the public have an audience, but not be also thinking of the downsides and the concerns, I think presents not just a breeding ground for toxic ego, but it also it just affects the way that society functions.
Well, I thank God that I am not going through middle school right now,
Totally.
or high school, because I can't imagine what it would feel like for, let's just say who I was at the time, where I wouldn't have an audience, and how that must affect, someone's confidence level, where I could almost imagine there's a new form out there, and maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but of like cyberbullying, right? Where it's like one day, all of the kids who were friends with you on Facebook said, screw you. And you wake up and all of your Facebook friends are gone, right? Like what that must feel like to a kid at that stage in their life, where this is all ego based. Like
yes.
It's just brutal. So like, I think this is an unbelievably important topic. And unfortunately, that's at such a young age where there's a very low chance that kids in middle school and high school are going to be exposed to information like this. Hopefully they will. And I don't know who it was or at what stage in my life where I was exposed to the concept of servant leadership. Mm-hmm. But that really appealed to me because I saw men empower men who have made huge accomplishments in their life continue to lead and do so without an ego. And the best way that they summed that up was servant leadership. And that's always the path that I saw for long-term success. So that's what I've strived to keep at the forefront of my approach to life. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think that's right. Look, servant leadership is essentially an antidote to the idea of, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And in one of the chapters in the book, I talk about the disease of me. And so Pat Riley, the NBA coach, and now he manages the Heat, he's talking about, so when a team starts, when they come together, they're on what he calls the innocent climb. And that's when, the team is working as a team, they're working together, they've got this crazy goal, and then they start to succeed. And then once they succeed, then the disease of me starts to rear its head. And the disease of me is instead of thinking about the team, now you start to think about yourself. Am I getting the ball often enough? Am I getting attention? Am I getting enough media attention? Am I getting enough respect from my teammates? Is the team paying me what I deserve? Why is so-and-so making more than me? Is this fair? I'm not going to play until you pay me enough, right? And so now the bonds that kept the team together start to fray. And so I think the disease of me is sort of what you're talking about a little bit too. And it's you could argue that social media is all about me, right? Follow me, friend me, like me on Facebook, look at what I did, click my link. And so instead of focusing on the work or focusing on the cause, you're focusing on getting credit or recognition. And I think most successful people admit or will tell you that your ability to accomplish things is inversely proportionate to how much you care about getting credit. And, look, this is an old rule of thumb, but it's like, if you want someone to agree to something, make it feel like it's their idea, right? So if you're egotistical and all you care about is someone acknowledging how smart you are and that you're right, that strategy is off the table for you from the get-go, right? Whereas, the person who says, look, I don't care, give me the lowest job in the company, the least paying role, but I'm going to work my way up to the top, and I'm going to work my way up by, creating opportunities and doing work and giving away ideas and being a resource. That is a strategy that depends on having conquered one's ego.
So I'm gonna go ahead and throw this out. This will be me opening up my kimono here in a pretty big way. But this is a unique opportunity to get your take on this because it is on this subject matter specifically. So, with the launch of my next company here, Q1 of 2017, in the hydroponic space, this is a very mission centric business for me, meaning that's my primary motivation is the end result in the product for the consumer. At the same time, it's going to create an opportunity for me to take my, let's just say, I don't know the best way to put this, but personal brand recognition or name recognition to a new level, right? Opportunities to get, put into publications that I've never been on or shows that I've never been on, whatever it may be, which has its advantages from a business standpoint. Opens a lot of new doors, has a lot of new opportunities attached to it, et cetera, et cetera. So I've been struggling with the decision, specifically when we launched the business of, do I keep the marketing and everything and the website as generic as humanly possible, or do I put myself in a more public spotlight as far as, the founder of the business and whatever it may be, because I can see advantages and disadvantages to both.
Sure.
And so what would you say about that?
Yeah, there's a great quote I have in the book from Tony Adams, who's a brilliant soccer manager, and he's saying, you play for the name on the front of the jersey, and they'll remember the name on the back. Is essentially what he's saying is like, if you're worried about being a star, your team's not going to be good enough for you to really be, as great of a star as you can be. I think Kobe Bryant's like an interesting example of a player who, when he was able to put his ego aside and play with other players, the Lakers won a bunch of championships. And then when he stopped being able to do that, he basically drove the franchise into the ground. And it will be a long time before the Lakers are able to recover from the legacy of Kobe Bryant. And so I would imagine for you, like in the short term, leveraging your name and identifying you with the product will have some benefits, right? Because, if it's all about Mike Dillard, the people who are Mike Dillard fans are going to buy it. However, you made this thing because you think it's an idea for the masses, right? You think this is a consumer product that fills a real and compelling need. And so if it fills a real and compelling need, I imagine that the real and compelling need is more universal and more accessible than Mike Dillard. As well known as you are and as loyal as people are to you, there's far more people who are like, I want to grow food and I don't, the current solutions, aren't adequate. So I would imagine that your best bet is to sort of keep to grow the Mike Dillard brand as much as possible, so that you can use it to cross promote the product you have, right? So every additional, let's say you start running ads for the product on your podcast, every additional listener you get is, more reach for the product. However, if you make the product about the product, then I think it will be more accessible to that general audience. So one of the things I see like a lot of info marketers do, or a lot of people who have big podcasts, is like they want to write a book, let's say. And so they want to write a book that's all about them. But and they might be well known in their space, but people in publishing have no idea who they are. And the mass audience has no idea who they are. So instead of focusing on having an amazing idea, having a book or a concept that would work, even if they weren't a well-known person, they make it all about them. It's I all throughout the book. And this actually puts off a huge potential part of the audience. So I know I've sort of haven't answered your question directly, but I would say strategically, I think you want the product to sell itself. And then you want to use your platform and your name to help get that product in front of its early audience. But then you want it to be able to stand and be on its own. Yeah. Especially because what if you ever sell this, right? They're not, if it's, we're not George Foreman, right? So it's like, if they wanted to if a company wanted to buy the product, they don't also want to have to buy your podcast. You know what I mean? Like they don't want to have to buy your name. They want to buy this independent entity that has a huge audience that can sell at retail and online and at events and all these things. So I think generally over the long term, you want to remove your ego as much as possible. It's like, we know that Elon Musk made the Tesla, but it's not called the Musk, it's called the Tesla.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. That's really great advice. At the end of the day, there is my core audience and you guys who are listening to the show who want to hear the story and about the product and the business, but then there's the general audience in the world who don't care. And I guess the great analogy of that is that Facebook did not become successful because of the name Mark Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg
Sure.
became a household name because of Facebook.
Well, and actually, I have a number of stories in the book. I think the story of John DeLorean is fascinating, right? And in many ways, he's the opposite of Elon Musk, right? He calls it the DeLorean. He's the day-to-day leader of the company. Everything runs through him. His chaotic life is reflected in the chaotic organization of the company. He micromanages, but he also doesn't manage enough, right? He's a brilliant marketer, but mostly for himself, not for the brand. And so when the car comes out and it doesn't do well, it's called the DeLorean, right? And so this sort of exercise in personal vanity and ego really comes back to bite him. And then, ironically, the sort of final twist is when he tries to make his money to fund the company with a controversial cocaine deal, and he gets arrested and goes through a very public trial, although he's ultimately acquitted. The personal controversy from him sinks and ruins the brand. If the CEO of General Motors, who DeLorean often pitted himself against, the CEO of General Motors had gotten caught, with a shipment of cocaine, General Motors wouldn't have gone out of business. It wouldn't have been a cataclysmic blow for General Motors because, the last guy, the CEO, his last name wasn't Motors, right? Or General. And so I think when we try to make a company or a business a monument to our own awesomeness, we often get ourselves in very serious trouble because we are humans and we are fallible, and we're trying, after all, to build something that's bigger than ourselves.
No, there's a lot of wisdom in that. One of the things that pops in my head, the sayings that I keep in the back of my head is, you're on the right track when you can think about your business from a standpoint of, it's not important that I do it, it's just important that it gets done.
Oh, that's great.
For me, with the hydro business, I can totally honestly say that it's not important that I do it, it's just important that this gets out and gets done.
Sure.
And if there is a company that is much more adept at taking this to the masses than I am, I'll be the first one to hand it over to them, and sell them the business,
Sure.
because that's, at the end of the day, all that really matters. So,
yeah. And with my writing, sometimes I'll get emails from people. They'll have read one of my books and then they'll have read another one and they'll go, I didn't know that you wrote both these books. Like they picked them up totally independently and they liked each one of them. And so to me, it's like, one, okay, I found two great topics to write about, and I take some validation in that. And the book was about the book, not about me. And if it's about me, the problem is, what if someone doesn't like me, right? I think that's the other part about, making the brand too much about yourself. You put a giant picture of yourself on the back cover or whatever. What if they don't like me? I'm fully aware that some people don't like me. It's like, hey, I don't like that guy's face. I don't like his voice, whatever. I don't want that to ever deter someone from getting value out of, a topic that I felt was worth hundreds of hours of my own time. And so what's so great about that quote is it's like, look, I just want to get this out in the world. Obviously, I would like to get credit for it. Obviously, I would like to be compensated for it. But I'm never going to let those two things trump getting it out into the world and reaching people with it, because ultimately that's what's most important to me.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a good litmus test for all of you out there on whether or not you're working on the right thing and if you're doing it in the right way. And, it's interesting, specifically being in the leadership business or, whatever. I hate the word guru because it's just not, that's not what I aspired to be. It's just, if you put out enough value in the world that, and a number of people start to take notice of it, you're all of a sudden in a position of leadership. And again, with the whole aspect of social media, I want everybody, as we're talking with Ryan, to listen about this, because it's really important. Social media is the ultimate rope. So, when Robert and I had our last business together, and we'd talk about people that we either hired or who wanted to be put into a management position, we'd be, okay, well, let's just give them some rope. Meaning we're going to give them enough slack and enough freedom to go either win or hang themselves, right? And so that's what social media is going to be doing on a daily basis with you as well. As you start to put yourself in a position of leadership, you're just getting more rope. And if you are going to portray a life of perfection and abundance that's free of challenge, or humility, you're saving up a bunch of rope, and at one day you're going to end up hanging yourself with that. So I would highly recommend that you dive into this topic. I think Ryan has obviously clearly here written the definitive piece on how to identify the pitfalls that come with ego, and then really turn them around and steer clear of that. And one of the past podcast guests we had on the show months ago, Garrett White, is probably the perfect example of this, where Garrett, had success, portrayed one kind of life where privately he was living another. And the moment he decided to come out and share that story and those challenges with the world and all of the personal problems he was having was the moment when his life and his career turned around, because now he was being honest and authentic and true to himself. And that is such a rare commodity in the world these days that the fact that you're willing to do that will automatically garner you, a loyal following, if you will, or an audience.
James Altucher has talked about that. You should write about the things you're afraid to say, because those are the things. It's two things. And I think the first one is obvious, then the other one not so much. First off, it's true and authentic and real, and people can relate to it, versus what feels fake or sales copy-esque or selfish or bad motives or whatever. But the other part is, if you say the things that other people are afraid to say, you have a lot less competition, right? So many people do what everyone else is doing, and then they wonder why it's so competitive and crowded. If you're being authentic and real and your unique self, well, there's only really one of you. And so you immediately stand out a little bit more than everyone else. And I think by gravitating towards what only you can do, like, if you're writing a book or you're creating a podcast, it's like, don't create another interview podcast because about, becoming the best version of yourself, because Mike Dillard already made that show, right? And so, you should ask yourself, like, if you're sitting down to create some project, am I the only one that could make this thing? And if the answer is no, then go back and keep tweaking it until it's the only one like it that exists. One of my favorite books is Blue Ocean Strategy, which is all about that. And actually one of the 22 immutable laws of marketing is invent your own category, right? And I think, part of what's so hard about ego is it's hard. Ego doesn't like to stand out because it likes to be recognized as number one, but it doesn't necessarily like to take risks, because risks subject you to criticism or alienation or feeling alone or being misunderstood. And so, but it just happens that that's actually how you do create great stuff that eventually does become the best.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've got about 5-10 minutes left here. What would you like to leave with the audience as far as maybe some actionable takeaways on how they can identify, where their ego is bringing them down, or what they can do moving forward to, benefit from solving this issue?
There's this quote from John Wheeler. He was a physicist who helped invent the hydrogen bomb. And he's saying, as our island of knowledge grows, so too does the shoreline of our ignorance. And what he means is, basically, the more you learn, the more you're exposed to things that you didn't know, right? You're bumping up against new topics, new people you've never heard of. You're while your knowledge has in fact increased, you're also becoming aware of all the things that you don't know. And so I think that idea that there's always something left to learn, and dedicating yourself to that, and I'm talking about in the aspirational field, you have to become a student, right? You have to say like, hey, I'm going to learn, I want to learn about this backwards and forwards. But then once you become successful, you have to be committed to staying a student. If you think that you've learned everything there is to learn, you're right, because you won't learn anything else. And so I think one of the maintaining this beginner's mindset throughout your entire life, whatever you do, is probably the single biggest way to defend against ego that there is. If you look at, you go into an MMA gym right now, the nicest guy is probably going to be the guy who is actually the best. Mm-hmm. Because he doesn't, and the biggest asshole will be like, like a 3-striped white belt who is convinced that they're good, but in fact is not even close to being good, right? And so the more you dedicate yourself to learning, the more inherently humble you will be and become. And I think what I love about writing is that every day it's hard. And in fact, it gets harder every day because my standards get higher and what I'm trying to do gets more difficult. And I think that's true for many, many different crafts or ventures. But ego can sort of blow right past that. And look, it's not easy to wake up and still not feel like you've mastered something you've been working on for the last 10 years. Ego is more comfortable in the short term, right? It's easier to think that you're fucking amazing and that you've figured it all out and that you're the best. That feels good. So you have to be willing to put those feelings aside and be willing to feel, occasionally inferior, or, that there's a lot left to learn. Like Socrates is considered the wisest man who ever lived because he knew what he didn't know. And I think if you can imitate that, you're going to not only learn a lot more, paradoxically, but you're not going to have to deal with the toxic effects of ego as much.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm in total agreement with that, and I'm just reflecting as you're talking about the decisions and the opportunities that I've made in my life, and specifically with what I'm dealing with now. And I've found that approach to be absolutely the most productive. The audience has heard it many times on this podcast. I will be the first to admit my fault and or faults. And when I love this show because this obviously gives me an opportunity to speak to people like yourself who are experts in other areas that I am not. And this is a personal classroom for me that, I get to take advantage of. One of the next episodes that we're going to have is a gentleman named David, who's one of the godfathers of angel investing out in Silicon Valley. And, that's obviously a topic that I'm getting more interested in. And here I am getting to learn from one of the best in the world because of the show and the fact that I'm willing to say, I have no idea what this is about and I'd like to figure it out, rather than me sitting here trying to pretend that I know something about angel investing, right? So,
sure. Well, and even just that you're taking the time with your company, right? I think, one of the things that's so dangerous is that sort of when we're passionate about something, we just want to get it done as soon as possible. And we want to rush it out into the world because we're desperate for that feedback. And so this is where confidence comes in. The confidence and the self-awareness to say, hey, this is pretty good, but it's getting better every day. So every day that I wait, the better it will be when it launches. And that requires restraint, that requires self-discipline, it requires confidence, and it also requires an absence of ego. And I think, that puts you in a position to succeed better ultimately.
Very cool. So what, from a long-term perspective, Ryan, after having written this book, you're setting yourself up for, a lifetime of amazing production. And obviously this is now about a mission for you and the lessons you've learned at this young age in your career. The template's wide open for you. What is your ultimate goal and long-term vision for your life and your career?
I love writing. And so and what I love about writing is it's something you can do basically, until the day that you die. And so for me, I'm trying to stay focused on building and establishing a career that might let me do that. So, it can be easy to get distracted with all these other things, whether it's consulting or speaking or whatever. Or just, enjoying the luxuries of some modicum of financial success. But I'd like to, I'd like to stay focused and disciplined. And, I want to start writing the next book. I don't know what it is yet, but I want to start thinking about it. And so for me, I love writing these books on practical philosophy. I love, making myself better through researching and thinking and spending so much time on them. And that's a process, hopefully I'll get to continue.
Awesome. Well, I mean, it's amazing to have figured out your passion and talent in life and have the opportunity to dedicate your years to that. So, I for one really appreciate your wisdom and your work. I've learned a ton from you and will continue to do so, I am sure. So, man, thank you so much for writing this. Guys, go pick up your copy. It's Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday. Go pick up a copy on Amazon. And Ryan, where else can people connect with you and follow you and everything that you're going to do in the future?
So I'm at Ryan Holiday on Twitter. I think I'm at Ryan Holiday on Instagram. And then I have an email list where I recommend books that I'm reading sort of on the course of my own journey through these topics, which is also on my website at ryanholiday.net.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, Ryan, thank you once again for joining us, for the time and for the wisdom. Guys, we will see you next week, but make sure you go pick up a copy of Ego is the Enemy in the meantime, and we'll talk to you soon.